The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Now, one of the key recommendations in the IMF's Governance Diagnostic Report was SOE reform. Reform in state-owned enterprises. The government has recently established an SOE restructuring unit to also drive SOE reform. However, there are a host of myths surrounding state-owned enterprises. So today's conversation will entail busting some of these myths. I'm so pleased to welcome to the studio Mr. Manjula de Silva, former CEO, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, also having vast years of experience in the field of public enterprise reforms. Good evening and welcome to the show, Mr. de Silva.
Good evening, Sonali. It's a pleasure to be here.
Mr. de Silva, we need to bust some of the myths surrounding SOEs. Let's start with what encompasses an SOE, because a lot of the myths start there.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point because a state-owned enterprise is basically a commercial entity owned by the state. Now, there is a feeling that there are about over 500 odd SOEs, which is not correct, right? Because there are state-owned institutions, more than 500, but many of them are regulatory agencies, research institutions. They are involved in, there are educational institutions and so on, right? But if you take the definition of a commercial enterprise, which is an entity which generates most of its revenue by selling a product or a service,
Sure.
right? Then we are talking just about 130 odd SOEs.
Right. Now, one of the misconceptions surrounding SOE reform is you immediately go to selling off assets or privatization. However, there's a huge paradigm, huge set of options apart from these two. So if you can take us through those options, because sometimes we tend to, without knowing, demonize SOE reform.
Absolutely. I mean, privatization is one option. Of course, I will later explain that privatization is sometimes the best option for certain entities. But having said that, there are lots of other tools also one can use. Now, in certain markets, state entity operates in a monopoly kind of position, right? So there is room in some of those markets to bring in competition, right? And by breaking down the monopoly, creating competition, that is also another form of reform that can really create more value.
So liberalizing the market.
Liberalizing the market, right? So that is one. Then also there is the possibility of listing an institution and maybe divesting a small stake in the stock market and having it listed so that you become exposed or driven by the disciplines of the market.
Sure.
Right? So that's one option. And where actually the government, for strategic reasons, wants to retain ownership of an entity where it doesn't want to divest full control, that's something always that can be considered. And also where even if you want to retain ownership of certain entities for whatever the reason, you could still cluster them and bring them under a independent holding company.
Right.
Right. So which is something that has been done very successfully in certain markets. In Singapore, there's an organization called Temasek. In Malaysia, we have Khazanah. So these entities, basically what they do is they act like a holding company of a group. And they will ensure that there is proper governance in all the entities that they supervise, and they manage the performance of these entities. And that way also you can basically ensure there is very little political interference in the management of these entities, right? Which is something, again, that is hampering their growth.
Okay. Now, the main objective of a state-owned enterprise is to get optimum results for all its stakeholders, ensure that the best product or service is provided, make profits, and a host of other objectives. Can you take us through this set of objectives that should be prioritized by SOEs, which we see aren't being prioritized in most.
That's right, yeah, because I think the starting point should be the consumer interest.
Right.
Because if you really look at some of these entities, I mean, they are producing and offering a very important product or a service to the public, right? And in some cases, they are in a monopolistic situation. In some cases, maybe in a oligopolistic market with you get one or two other players as well. But often, because of their dominant status, they determine the price that all consumers have to pay. So, the only way in which actually, if you want to make it more affordable, if you want to make these products and services more affordable to the general public, right, the only way to achieve that is through some form of reform. Because how we have so far tried to do that is by subsidizing, which doesn't work, right? I mean, all this time, the entities either carry the subsidy, resulting in huge losses being run by these entities, or you expect the treasury to subsidize, which also it is not capable of doing anymore. So, if you really look at consumer interest, and that is what actually the government should always consider as its topmost priority, you have to see how can we bring in competition and help to bring down the prices of these products and services that are so critical to the consumers. And here, when you are talking about consumers, it's not only the individual consumers, but you have to also think of the businesses as well. Because I've heard many people in business today complaining that, I mean, with the current level of the utility costs, for example, that they can't operate their businesses. So, if they are to be competitive, then you have to bring these costs down, and you have to do it without being a burden to the state, right? So, that is where the reform process becomes absolutely important, and also at the same time making sure that the government gets a sufficient value out of these entities, because even where you are making a profit, right, sometimes by letting go of these entities, where under private ownership, where they can make a much larger profit, right, you may be able to generate more income to the government by way of taxes than what they may be today getting in the form of both taxes and dividends. So, it's a matter of looking at it from the viewpoint of each and every stakeholder, including the employees. Of course, I mean, if you look at most of the privatized entities, haven't the employees got a better deal, right? I mean, there are lots of entities today operating as private enterprises, which were at one time under the state, right? And they are, I mean, today you don't hear the employees of those entities complaining at all. So, one can create value, Sonali, for all the stakeholders by going through a well-structured reform program, which would be the objective of a SOE restructuring exercise.
Mr. De Silva, this next question may be a bit of a simplistic question, but it's an important question that needs to be asked, I feel. Now, it is this massive crisis at hand that has made SOE reform such a hot topic. But we have structures and processes in place. Having had those structures and processes in place, why have we been okay accepting loss-making SOEs for years and years, maladministration in SOEs for years? Why? Like, there is a disconnect there.
Yeah, I mean, just to answer your question, like, I must first explain, this is also a myth to some extent, that most of the entities are loss-making, which is really not the case. Actually, if you take any single accounting year, about 2/3 of the SOEs are actually making a profit, which is something not known to most of the people. And it's just about, say, 1/3 who make losses. And out of that also, it's just about 3 or 4 entities who account for more than 90% of the loss.
Right.
Right.
But these are substantial,
Absolutely.
significant losses which
Correct.
can't be overlooked.
Correct, yeah. So when it comes to those few entities, that is an absolute factor. So that is where partly, I mean, this has happened due to this government's policy of trying to subsidize some of these utilities and keeping the prices artificially down,
Right.
right? Through a strategy which is obviously not sustainable, right? So what has happened is these institutions have run losses, as you said, and then those losses get compounded when they run out of cash flow, and they run to whom? Back to the state banks, and they borrow, run up huge interest costs, and adding more and more to the losses, right? Which at the end of the day, finally, the government has to pick up, right? So that is the story as far as, some of those entities are concerned. But that at the same time, when you talk about the rest of the entities, there are many who may be making a profit, right? But still, a lot of them are sitting on huge pools of assets, right? Underutilizing them totally because they don't have the capital to invest and get the best out of the assets that they possess, right? Because now, if you take, I mean, any entity, any enterprise needs constant injection of capital. If you are a hotel, you have to keep on renovating, keep on refurbishing. If you are a factory, the machinery has to be upgraded. The plantations require fertilizer, it needs agricultural inputs. But a lot of the time, the government as the principal shareholder doesn't have the capacity to put money into these businesses.
Right.
So that is partly the reason why they have gone down. Of course, there are other issues, lack of governance, political interference, etc. also, which have further added to make the situation worse.
All right. We are in conversation with Mr. Manjula de Silva, former CEO of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. We're going for a short commercial break.
The People's Platform.
බින්දුවටම ප්‍රතික්ෂේප කරපු සමහර දේශපාලන ප්‍රවාහයන් ආයෙනවා කලාව නාව. ඒකෙත් කලාවක් තියෙනවා. ඒක කලාව. ඒ මොකක්ද? කොහොමද ඒක කියවන්නේ?
තරුණයෝ ඉල්ලුවේ සිස්ටම් චේන්ජ් එක. ඒක උනේ නෑනේ.
ඒක හදන්න මිනිස්සු ඉන්නව නැත්තේ නෑ.
IMF එකෙන් ණය ගත්ත හැකි. ඔව්. ආර්ථික කඩාවැටීම. මේ සංස්කෘතික කඩාවැටීම සිදු වුණාන් පස්සේ අපි කාගෙන්ද ණයට ගන්න කියන ප්‍රශ්නේ තියෙනවා.
මොකක් හරි කරගෙන කාට හරි ගෙයිමක් දීලා කීයක් හරි හොයාගෙන ඉන්න නම් පුරුෂාර්ථය හැදිලා තියෙන ජීවිතේ එතනින් එහාට යගේ හියුමන් ලයිෆ් එකේ ගමනක් නෑනේ.
මිනිස්සු ප්ලෑන් කරපු ජීවිත නැති වෙලානේ හැමෝටම තමන්ගේ ජීවිතය අහිමි.
ප්‍රජාතන්ත්‍රවාදයේ දරිද්‍රතාවයක් කියනවා. Poverty of democracy.
බුද්ධිමය සංවාදය බ්‍රහස්පතින්දා රාත්‍රී 10:30 මාවත.
Thousands of singers battling for one crown.
Shakti Crown. TV1. TV for life.
Sumandiran, sole representative from the opposition at the President's IMF program meeting. Operation Yuktiya to be expanded from today. In-depth investigations into drug traffickers. Harakata in court, moved to detention until April 26th. Railway workers clash with locals in Kompanya Vidya. Trains along coastal route halted for several hours. No investors, no jobs. Minister Nimal Siripala de Silva's ultimatum for the national airline. Oppenheimer bags Best Picture at 96th Academy Awards.
People's Platform.
State-owned enterprise reform. Are we walking the talk? Let's find out. My guest tonight is Mr. Manjula de Silva, former CEO, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Mr. de Silva, SOE reform is not a novel concept. This has taken place in the 1990s, the early 2000s, which saw several SOE reform initiatives. Can you take us through that whole journey?
Yes, Sri Lanka has a rich experience in actually going through this process, although maybe a lot of the people today either don't remember or some of the younger generation are not aware. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about that. So actually from 1989 to 2002, if you take that 13-year period,
okay.
There have been something like 84 divestments, either full or partial privatizations that have taken place. And the interesting point here is that this happened during two regimes. From 99 to 94, we had one regime, during which period 42 entities have been privatized, and an almost equal number got divested in the 94 to 2002 period under a different regime after a change of government. So that showed that there was a period where sometimes even after a change of government there had been some continuity as far as key economic policies were concerned. And some of these entities today are operating as major enterprises within the private sector,
right.
Generating a lot of value. Actually, in terms of the tax revenue they generate, in terms of the value they add to the customers and the employees.
Right.
If you interview the employees of some of these privatized entities, you find that today they are a very happy lot, although maybe at that time they would have had apprehensions as most would have had. But you hardly hear any labor unrest in any of those organizations.
Right.
So that is something that we need to look back at and try to learn. Of course, there may have been some failed privatizations also. Most of the time where there were failures, it happened not due to the policy being wrong, but due to the way it was implemented.
Sure.
Yeah, there have been sometimes flaws in the execution that would have led to issues. So we can learn from both the successes as well as the failures. But of course, unfortunately, since 2002, we have had this long period of time where there has been very little progress on this front. And from time to time, we have tried to get this going, but it never happened. And so it's happy to note that at least today there's this new SOE restructuring unit which is really trying to get this whole program back on track.
We're looking at impending elections. Policy stability is of paramount importance, isn't it?
Absolutely. That is one big worry that all of us have, because we can see some steps being taken in the right direction, certain reforms getting started, but certainly these processes need some time, right?
Sure.
Now we are working on maybe a handful of institutions, but there are lots more that need to come into this path. So what you don't want to see is a situation where you just get through a few steps and then there's a change of government and somebody comes in completely reverses the direction. We cannot afford to do that today. And so actually one has to look back at 1994 and see and maybe take a lesson, draw a lesson from that experience where there was a change of government, and some institutional changes happened. For example, PERC was created after 1994 as an institutional body to drive the reform process. So certain improvements were made, right? But they still stuck to that same economic strategy of moving out of what were considered as non-strategic state-owned enterprises. So whatever strategy, if it is good for the country, we have to hope that whoever comes to power will continue that with necessary improvement.
Earlier on in the conversation, Mr. De Silva, you said that a lot of SOEs are sitting on so many valuable assets. There are underutilized assets, and the government fails to pump in the capital. But also on the other side, there are boards of directors that are appointed to look into the governance. However, there are key issues with respect to their appointment, politicization, political interference. And this is notwithstanding the fact that we have procedures in place. So in order for any future SOE reform process to be successful, we have to make sure that we put a stop to all of these maladministration related matters as well, right?
Yes, certainly. I mean, that is very, very important, because at the top of any entity is the board. And if you don't get the right people onto a board, you can't really expect that institution to go forward. And actually, that's a structural weakness that we have, because in most cases, these institutions have been set up by an act of parliament, where the act allows the minister in charge of the subject to appoint the board of directors. So naturally, these tend to be political appointees, and who often, do not understand the subject matter very much, and they have their own agendas. So one of the ways in which we can get over that problem is really to go back to that holding company model that I mentioned before, where you get all these entities to report to a holding company which is run professionally, and which has its own board of directors, again independent set of people, and where they take over the task of appointing the boards of the respective entities which are under their control. Right, and if that can be done, I mean, then you kind of professionalize the whole governance process. So, which is also absolutely important. Otherwise, you're always going to end up on a sticky wicket. Right.
Yeah, that's a fabulous idea, but then the policymakers need to have the political will to appoint such a holding company, right?
Yes. So at the moment, I have some hope, because the cabinet has actually approved this concept, and they have, I think, started the process of setting up a company. But it's very important that at the very beginning itself, you appoint the right people to the board of that entity, because if they are to appoint the boards of other entities, you must first get that board right. And one proposal that I would like to make is that you make sure that it is independent. You have people who don't have any conflicts of interest, and ideally, if you can get the Constitutional Council or some independent body like that to make those appointments, then it will give you the comfort that you're not going to go through the same process, and that this is not going to be just another cosmetic exercise.
Fabulous. As a concluding question, I'd like to ask you, now when we say SOE reform, we're also looking at good reforms which will benefit these SOEs. So we shouldn't just take the loss-making SOEs into this equation, but the others can also learn from these processes. So when we say SOE reforms, shouldn't these reforms trickle down to all the SOEs in terms of the practices, the best practices?
Yeah, I mean, only thing is, like, you can't adopt a kind of a broad brush approach, right? Because some of these entities are loss-making, so they have different kinds of issues. Then you have the profitable entities, right? Which again, of course, although we consider them as profitable, they're still not really optimizing on their profit. They're not optimizing on their return on assets, right? So each one you have to look at it differently. Some are in a monopolistic situation. Some are competing with other private sector entities. So there are different forces at play. But in all these cases, I think there are one or two disciplines which every entity, which should adhere to, like what we see in the private sector.
Right.
Now, one is governance. Good governance is always going to help, having not only a proper board, but having, other practices in place, having an audit committee, having internal audit processes, a proper reporting process, and then also performance management,
Right.
where every entity has to report on its performance to another body which will monitor the performance, challenge them, ask questions. Today that is not happening.
Right.
Right? So that is where again that holding company kind of structure can help, where the institutions are going to remain under state ownership. But of course, going back to the starting point, I feel that many entities need not remain with the government, right? Lot of them can be divested.
Okay.
Right? Because government basically should not stay in business. Government's role is to look after the consumer, right? Now, when you are both the consumer and the producer, or when you have to look after the interests of both parties, it runs into a conflict, right? When you are one of the key producers in a sector, how are you going to be looking after the consumer's interest? So it is much better that government takes a step back.
Right.
You become the policy maker, you become the regulator. Let the private sector do the commercial part of it, do the whatever, production part of it, and serve the customers. And you, as the policymaker, as the regulator, do what is needed to look after the interest of the consumer.
Sure.
I think that's what the government should be doing in most cases, where of course there can be exceptions.
And finally, what's your take on the progress of SOE reforms thus far?
I feel happy that they have made a fair amount of progress, it's a very challenging environment to do this kind of thing, but in spite of that, I think on the few selected institutions that where they started the process, they are going about in a fair and transparent manner. Of course, where I think we saw the level of interest shown by potential investors, where we saw EOIs coming up, in some instances was not very encouraging. So I have a question mark as to whether we are doing enough to market these entities. You have to create a little bit more awareness among the potential investors, have road shows and other things which we used to do in the past. So that is one aspect we need to look at, because some instances we saw the responses were very few, right? So that is one concern. But apart from that, of course, I think in terms of fairness and transparency and following a structured process, they've done a pretty good job so far.
All right. Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mr. Manjula de Silva, for sharing your perspectives and expertise with us. Thank you. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night.